Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Quarantine Cuisine. My name is John Bredenberg. I'll be your host again today as we talk about a very important topic, the topic of wasting less food. It's estimated that Americans waste approximately $1,500 in food each year from their homes. Now, that's an average. Averages can be somewhat misleading. I mean, on average, if a billionaire walks into my office right now, then on average, we're both rich. So that may not be your specific dollar value as far as the amount of food wasted at your house, but chances are, if you're watching this webinar and you've wasted some food, you want to tell yourself, gosh, I wish I didn't do that. So we're going to talk about some tips to help you save some money, but also more importantly, minimize food waste. Not only does it have financial implications, but it has much greater ecological implications too. So it's all important that we look at conservation efforts to figure out some simple things that you can do in your home kitchen to help minimize food waste. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get out of the way here so you can see what's going on. Again, as before, we're going to share this presentation with everybody after today's webinar. So as soon as you send in your information about your wellness credit, we'll make sure in the reply you get a copy of this particular presentation. So when we look at food waste overall, as we all know, there's a lot of food waste in the supply chain, from the farms to the restaurants and the grocery stores, as well as our own house. But our households in general account for about 2/3 of our overall waste in this country. And most of that food waste, if we look at all the different contributors to household food waste, most of it is because of spoilage. You know, we look at foods that are spoiling because of improper storage or maybe lack of visibility in your refrigerator. At one point or another, each of us has thrown something out that unfortunately was spoiled well before its time. So we want to make sure that we look at ways to help minimize food spoilage. So part of what we'll talk about today are the right way to store fruits and vegetables, and some ways to help extend the shelf life of other products and multi-use products that can make sure that we continue to get the most bang for our buck from a food dollar standpoint. So again, most of our food waste, if we look at all the sources, is going to be because of spoilage. The other big contributor in terms of household food waste is going to be over preparation. You know, a lot of times we become paralyzed if we're having company and friends over of running out of food. So we have the tendency to over prepare. So it's important to change your mindset to make sure that you're not over preparing food and understanding what are going to be some reasonable serving sizes as you look at menu planning for numbers greater than 4, 5, 6 and on up. So we want to make sure that we're minimizing our over preparation by understanding a little bit more about what a proper serving size could be. There's also a lot of confusion about label dates. I'm going to share with you some of the loose definitions of what those terms mean, but a lot of times we'll look at a date and feel that, oh, this must mean it's expired, when in fact that's not the case. A couple other avenues where we tend to waste food dollars is from over purchasing. So many of us might be enticed by those buy one, get one offers, and we might be induced to over purchase something that might spoil very quickly, like buy one, get one fresh salsa, or buy one, get one cookies, and all of a sudden we're left with leftover salsa and cookies that for some reason we weren't able to finish. And then another big contributor to food waste is because of the planning aspect. We don't have our menus planned for the week at a time, so buying that bag of carrots when we only needed 1 or 2 might lead us to perhaps waste the rest of those carrots. So proper planning can go a long way to help minimizing food waste. So before we talk about some of the steps that you can take at your own home kitchen, I wanted to kind of clear up some of the confusion about label dates. Now, the truth is, there's really no strict regulation for what these terms are to mean. And except for baby formula, they are not even required by food manufacturers. The one that probably needs the most attention is the sell-by date. So this is really just telling the store how long to keep the item on their shelf. If the item is on that shelf past that date, the store has to pull it based on their own company guidelines. And that's typically when the freshness isn't going to be at its peak. The same for best if used by and used by dates. So both of these dates, the best if used by and used by, are really referring to food quality. So once the food goes beyond that particular date listed on the package, the quality of that food starts to deteriorate pretty rapidly. Doesn't mean it's going to be unsafe, but it's not going to be at its peak quality. And then sometimes you'll also see expiration dates, but that's really going to be the same as a sell-by date. If we dig a little bit deeper, if we look at two areas or two types of foods where we really notice spoilage can occur pretty quickly right after specific dates, it would be from milk and eggs. Typically with milk, when it's spoiled, you can tell just by smelling it. But with eggs, it's not always as clear. Now, typically on most packagings, if you see a sell-by date, those eggs, that carton of eggs, are gonna last another 3 to 4 weeks. If you're uncertain as to what that timeline would look like, you can easily test the freshness of your eggs by just dropping it in a bowl of water. If it's fresh, it's going to sink to the bottom. If it's too old to eat, if it's spoiled, you're typically going to see it float to the top. So something to consider when we're looking at trying to evaluate the freshness of our food items. And again, try to minimize that one avenue of food waste through the spoilage. So the first thing to do, so let's say, okay, well, I'm trying to make sure I don't waste as much money in the kitchen. We don't want to throw money into the trash can. So typically what I would suggest, and this is the most important part, and that's trying to learn from your past. What that means is taking a look for, let's say, 30 days would be a good suggested timeline, and track all of your food waste. In other words, what are you noticing that you're finding yourself throwing away? Is it bread? Is it vegetables? Is it fruit? Is it cereal? Is it eggs? Are there recurring trends in some of this food waste that you're noticing? That's where you can learn a lot about recipe development and menu planning. If you notice you're continuing to throw away fresh bread, well, that tells you that perhaps you can ask the bakery for a half loaf of bread, or purchasing smaller quantities of specific types of produce, or freezing which you may not be using right away. So looking at specifically what your particular household tends to discard the most will give you a lot of insight moving forward. One thing to be mindful of when we look at tracking of food waste is something called the Hawthorne effect. And what this is basically telling you that anytime you observe a behavior, you're likely to change it. So don't be surprised if your food usage trends change a little bit just because you're observing it. The same effect is very true when we look at food diaries. So when we talked about weight management, keeping food records is a good way to help minimize some of those extra calories because it's forcing you to observe your own behavior. So that's just something to be mindful of when we look at food waste. But typically, if you're trying to save money in the kitchen, it's important to figure out, okay, what are some of the trends in your current food utilization that you can change right away? And then the next thing to do is to get that kitchen organized. I mean, going through your cabinets, figuring out what's your current inventory, trying to get the cabinets and refrigerator organized by the type of menu group, whether it's your starches, your vegetables, your fruit. If you can find it easily and you can see it where it's being kept, you can easily keep a working inventory. And usually the clear containers can help you identify pretty quickly what products are. I would suggest you use some of the airtight containers for some of your pantry storage. So if you find that you're being tricked by how much cereal or how much pasta or how much rice you have because you can't see how much is in the box, you might want to transfer that to a clear container so you know exactly what you're doing in terms of overall day-to-day meal planning. And the other thing to consider is when we look at kitchen organization beyond the food choices is take a look at those tools in your cabinets that are taking up space, whether it's an apple core or some other types of kitchen tools that just don't use or only have one use. Getting those out of there, getting them out of the way can free up some space and minimize some of the clutter and also minimize some of the frustration that you might be experiencing as you try to do some more home food preparation. But really getting it organized, easy to track, easy to maintain your own inventory. And when we look at menu planning, shopping from your own pantry, meaning using up what you have already on hand, is a good way to continue to also stretch that food dollar. So we're going to get organized. We're going to learn from our past mistakes. And then third, want to plan ahead, meaning decide in advance what you're going to eat for the week. Now, as the restaurants start to reopen, we'll be able to do a little bit more dining out, but not only from a nutritional standpoint is menu planning helpful, it's also helpful from a financial standpoint because it's going to help you minimize that waste. So if you know you've purchased 2 pounds of carrots, we can figure out, okay, using this menu, how can I make sure I utilize all of the carrots that I've purchased so I'm not putting them to waste, or all the potatoes that I may have purchased. Make sure when you're developing your menu, use your family favorites as a guide. Be strategic with anything new you want to try. If you find a new recipe on Pinterest or some of the websites, you don't want to overload your family with one new item after another because that could increase the tendency for food waste. So just be strategic with anything new that you're trying to try with your family. I talked about shopping from your pantry and your refrigerator first when we're developing our weekly menus, but also make sure when you're developing that grocery list, stick to it. Stick to that list. It'll minimize some of those random purchases that you might be tempted because of buy one, get one offers and things like that that are at the supermarket. You're being realistic with what you actually intend to use. I typically discourage people from buying anything buy one, get one, unless it's something that they always use in their weekly menus and it's something that's not perishable, meaning it's not going to induce you to want to overeat. If you're purchasing buy one, get one dozens of chocolate chip cookies, well, that sounds good, but unless you're hosting a big party, you might find yourself overeating chocolate chip cookies. And another thing to keep in mind, now every farmer's market's a little bit different in terms of pricing, but if you can check out the farmer's market that's over off Beaver Street, you usually see pretty good deals there, so you can alternate your big box grocery store trips with some of the smaller farmers markets, and that'll help you save a lot of money on fruits and vegetables, because that can be a big cost driver of food waste, the fruits and vegetable component of your menu. What you see on your screen is just a little fun grocery list. I do most of the grocery shopping at my house, but sometimes I like to trick my wife and I'll give her a list and have her try to find fat-free hummus or 3% milk. So again, something to have some fun with, but I think that list is pretty funny there on your screen. But using a grocery list is a good way to help stay on track nutritionally and from a financial standpoint too. If we look at some other ways to really save money and waste less food in the kitchen, again, it's all about being resourceful and having a lot of adequate inventory for canned beans, pasta, rice, sauces. These can be the foundation for a lot of last minute meals that maybe you didn't have a menu set up for, so you can always piece together ideas. I'm going to share with you some websites that are real good resources for basically helping you piece together random ingredients into something that can be a very tasteful meal. Look at your menu and try to prioritize those items that tend to spoil faster. So those are your green leafy vegetables, your fish, as well as your meats, making sure you're using those up first if you're keeping them in the refrigerator. And then, as I said before, try to avoid over preparation, making sure you're not over preparing food and therefore inclined to overeat. Everyone has guidelines in terms of what he or she likes to eat in terms of usual serving size. I mean, this is a well-publicized resource that you see in a lot of nutrition classes as far as what's a standard serving for meat and what's a standard serving for starch and other vegetables. So give you an idea of what that might look like in terms of a visual standpoint. So if you're purchasing 1 pound of chicken, but you're just cooking it for yourself, chances are you're going to end up with a lot of leftovers that you need to kind of repurpose for a dish later on that week or freeze for later use. So that way you're not putting it to waste, because in addition to fruits and vegetables, meat is another big component that can be wasted. And as many of you know, meat can be the most costly part of the menu too. So talking about those foods that spoil the most quickly brings us to our fruits and vegetables. And I try to tell people, I try to think of all the produce that you buy like visiting family. If you don't find something to do with them pretty quickly, they're going to really start to annoy you. All right, so you want to get them into your menu as soon as you can, or they're really going to start to bother you. So take a close look at what you're purchasing. Do you have a plan for the next couple of days? If not, make sure you're going to freeze it or repurpose it in some other menu item. That way you don't end up throwing it away. You can cook and freeze a lot of those vegetable items without any deterioration in quality, but if it's a fresh vegetable, so let's say you've got a big bag of green beans, you can blanch the green beans. What that means is to cook them in boiling water just for a minute or two, throw it in some ice water, and then throw that in the freezer. What happens is if we're not doing that in advance to many of the vegetables, the green beans and the carrots, they can turn brown pretty quickly in that freezer. So blanching is something that you can do to kind of deactivate some of the enzymes that really facilitate the browning of vegetables. So again, transferring food from the fresh state to the freezer state is a good way to help lock in some of the nutrients, but also really kind of stop any food spoilage. Because once we put it in the freezer, it's going to be pretty safe for an indefinite period of time. The longer it's in there, for those of you that attended our frozen food workshop or webinar, that's where the quality starts to diminish. But really take a close look at what you're purchasing in terms of fruits and vegetables. Hopefully you may have learned something when looking at that 30-day recap of where your food waste is, and that can really help you save a lot of money, because when we're throwing away a lot of fruits and vegetables, not only are we losing a lot of money, but we're also losing a lot of potential nutrition too. And again, it's all about trying to maximize freshness. So in addition to sharing some of these basic slides that we have in this presentation, I'm also going to give to you this Keep It Fresh guide that was actually developed by the American Heart Association, but it really tells you the best locations to store certain types of fruits and vegetables. Not everything needs to go in the refrigerators. Things like onions and garlic and sweet potatoes and squash, that needs to be kept in the pantry. Items such as apples and pears and should say bananas on there. They can ripen at different rates. Apples and pears can produce ethylene gas, and that can facilitate the ripening of other foods at a much faster rate. So again, those are the foods that you typically want to keep separate from other fruits and vegetables because of how it can affect the ripening stages of some of those foods. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is a mistake that I've seen happen time and time again, is the tendency to want to wash fruits and vegetables before storing, specifically vegetables. The reason that it's a problem is not so much from a food safety standpoint, but the introduction of moisture after you wash it can really kind of fast track the spoilage. So the more moisture is around some of these fruits and vegetables, the quicker that they can spoil. So try to save the washing part of it, especially for vegetables, when it's ready to be eaten or served. So something to keep in mind when we talk about maximizing freshness. But this guide from the American Heart Association does a pretty good job at outlining where you should store foods in the refrigerator, in the countertop, as well as in the pantry, and that way you can get the maximum shelf life. Certain foods like your berries, your corns, everything you see on your screen there, the cucumbers, the greens, they tend to have a shorter shelf life, so you're not going to be able to store them in the fridge as long as you would some of the other types of foods, such as your apples and your pears and so forth. But again, those apples and pears, try to keep those separate from other foods because of that ethylene gas that they produce, and that can make things like peaches and so forth ripen a lot faster. Now, in addition to looking at ways to maximize freshness and really trying to prioritize the cooking of those foods and the storage of those foods that tend to spoil quicker, you can also think outside the box and consider adopting a zero waste cooking strategy. So this could be next level for some of you. It really involves taking a look at, okay, well, what am I actually throwing away that typically I don't eat? So stalks of celery, tops of carrots, some of the leftover onion and radish segments. You can store all that into a freezer bag, throw it in the freezer, and then make your own stock when that bag is full, just like you see on your screen there. Any overripe bananas or berries, I know we're all familiar with the different ways to make banana bread, or at least read about it. That's not the only way you can use overripe bananas. You can puree it and freeze it, and that can be the base for some good smoothies, along with any frozen milk or yogurt that may have soon to be spoiled. So placing that in the freezer again, before it spoils, before it gets too overripe, is a good way to help extend its shelf life and use it later on. You can use potato peels, make your own chips in the oven. You can use the peels and cores from apples and help infuse some flavor into some of your vinegars. And then if you'd also want to consider composting, there's a good resource at the University of Florida Cooperative Extension Office that shows you everything you need to know about the different types of composting, so you can take some of those fruits and vegetable scraps from your kitchen and use as a compost, which can be a real good fertilizer for your yard or for your own garden. So I'll have that link right there on this PowerPoint slide, so you can look at it for some more details and some more information. So besides the zero waste cooking aspect, we also have to be very careful with our leftovers. As we talked about in our food safety webinar, it's about a 3 to 4 day period where we really need to get those leftovers out of the fridge and either into our bellies or into the freezer. So leftovers can still happen even with a very good menu plan. So if you're dining out at a restaurant, once they start to reopen, don't be afraid to ask for a doggy bag. Just remember that 2-hour rule applies to food spoilage that's in that danger zone. So once you get the food from the restaurant, you've got 2 hours to get it in the refrigerator to minimize the overall risk of spoilage. You can also take a look at any leftover pasta, leftover rice. You can repurpose that into some soups. Any leftover meat, like a rotisserie chicken, you can freeze that and thaw it later. You can use that as part of a casserole or a stew. So things to consider using for some of those leftover products that you may have typically discarded. And then as you're planning your menus, so when we look at planning the menu 1 week at a time, you can already think ahead as to what those follow-up meals might be, assuming you're going to have leftovers. So the classic that I usually talk about is having a big rotisserie chicken, and any leftover chicken that's not eaten at that particular dinner time meal can be used the following day or the 2 days later, and you can make pulled chicken tacos. Or roast turkey can also be served as turkey soup later, or any leftover vegetables. Let's say you have a lot of mixed vegetables left over, you can save those in the fridge, make a breakfast hash the next morning by scrambling that with some eggs. So some things to consider when we look at repurposing some of our leftovers so we're not wasting that food. Okay, so remember, when we talk about wasting food, I'm not saying overeat food that you don't need, but figure out what you can do with that food item before it's even served. So that way you're gonna, again, minimize anything that's being thrown away, because nobody wants to throw away food. And if you're someone that's in a position where you have your own garden, you find you've yielded a surplus of produce, we might be bringing some nectarines or some grapefruit or some oranges into the office to share with family or friends, or any leftover casserole you can share with the neighbors. You can consider donations to local food banks. If you have a mass production of food that is a surplus, you don't discard it. You can also share it with shelters. And then another good resource, so if you're somebody that has your own garden and you found that you're yielding a surplus of produce, you can use that website, ampleharvest.org, and find a local food pantry that you can take some of those products to. So again, so they aren't going to waste. You go to that website, type in your zip code, and it'll give you some locations that possibly would be willing to take on some of that food, so we can ensure it gets to a good place. And then, lastly, just talking about some of those online tools that I mentioned before. So one that I like is called Big Oven. So it's up there on your screen right there in the middle there. You basically select what ingredients you have left or left over or on hand, and it can tell you what type of dishes that you can make with it. Super Cook, that's also what you see on your screen there. That's another good app that, again, you just basically type in what you have available. Epicurious has something as well where you're basically selecting what items you have on hand, and it'll piece together some menus that, let's say you had some beans and some tomatoes and some chicken left over, and it'll give you 10 different recipes that you can make with those items. And if all else fails, you can always just use Google. So you can actually type in your ingredients into the search bar, use the plus sign. So let's say you had some leftover celery, plus carrots, plus chicken, and then boom, it's going to kick back literally 35 million results for you. So there are some recipes to consider using those particular ingredients. Now again, it's Google, so it's not going to be perfect. It may have raw chicken versus cooked chicken, but again, you get the idea. There are some resources that you can use wherever you see food when you're shopping from your own fridge first. and shopping from your own pantry and figuring out what can I do with this. Those are resources at your disposal to make sure that those foods get used somehow, some way, and don't end up in the trash. So those are your big tips in terms of trying to save more money in the kitchen and waste less food. Just like before, if you want to get wellness credit for this particular webinar, just type your name in, or just type Waste Less Kitchen into the email, and we'll get you 10 points. And in reply to that email, we'll send you a copy of the slides, as well as this produce storage guide from the American Heart Association, so you can make sure that whatever you're cooking, or purchasing for your family at home, gets stored in the proper location. So again, hopefully you take away some information from this presentation that can help you and help your family save some money, because we do tend to waste a lot of food, and most of it's just because of a little bit of planning isn't being done. So a lot of planning can go a long way to save some money. I'm going to open up to some questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to take a moment and type it into the chat bar. All right. So that way we make sure any questions that we didn't cover in the presentation, we get addressed. So here's a question. Should we be concerned about buying foods with preservatives that help extend the shelf life? Are there some preservatives that are better than others we should look for on the nutrition facts label? So they're really, that's a tough question to answer, because there aren't a great deal of preserves out there that are being utilized anymore. Most of the preserves that are used in food also have a functional preference to also help with flavor. A great example of this would be sugar. So you'll often see sugar added to bread that you find in the bread aisle, but it's added to bread to help maintain the moisture, so it extends the shelf life. And it's just a small amount of sugar. It doesn't have any, outside of it just being sugar, any harmful side effects per se. But there aren't any other preserves at top of mind that come to mind that I would think would be problematic outside of salt. But typically salt really isn't used as a preservative anymore, because it's often part of canned products to help maintain the firmness of certain vegetables and add a little bit of flavor. But yeah, there aren't really any preserves that I look for on the label and say, "Ooh, I need to not use this anymore," just because of all the other issues with our food. We look at the added sugar, the added salt, the added fat. Those can be much more problematic than any just minute quantities of preserves. So that's a good question. Tough to answer, because again, most of the food that you'll see in the marketplace now, since consumers are demanding food that has minimal amount of additives, you'll see very clearly that they aren't even really using any of those preserves anymore. Even if they were using them, they're typically in products like Velveeta shells and cheese that really wouldn't be healthy for us even without the preservatives. So, something to consider when we look at food purchasing. But good question. Any other questions out there before we call it a day on this beautiful Friday? I'll give you a few moments to type anything in last minute that might be on your mind. Again, we'll have a copy of this presentation. If you missed anything, we'll put that on our website. If you go to Wellness TV, you'll find links to this presentation as well as other presentations that we've done in the past. We're trying to make sure we have something for everybody. So we're doing some physical activity webinars. We have, of course, all of our nutrition webinars. Next week, we've got some new programs lined up to talk about guided meditations. We're going to have some wellness trivia challenges so you can compete against one another and win some prizes, hopefully, in this particular context. So again, something for everyone coming up soon. As before and as always, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you.